Good morning, welcome to IndyCar on the 24th of October. Now, a lot of people will have heard of the organisation called Salvo, and Salvo takes its name actually from a Latin word which describes Scotland's unique law, which allows its own citizens even to sue its own government or remove them. A very unusual law, and something which Salvo is quite proud of, actually, having brought this particular word into public use again. But it's not the only word which has become commonplace. Now, once upon a time, it would have been taboo to suggest that Scotland was a colony. It would also have been taboo to mention the word liberation, or even UDI. There are lots of words which were taboos until recently. And also to mention the claim of right. Now, these are terms which members of Salvo know very well, because having researched the full history of Scottish constitutional, or the Scottish Constitution, I should say, we all know in Salvo exactly what our rights and responsibilities are under the Claim of Right Act. Now, the Claim of Right Act itself was an act of the Scottish Parliament, which was brought into effect at the same time that the English Bill of Rights was published in Westminster. This is before the Union Act took place. And that claim of right formed the basis of the conditionality of the Treaty of Union. That meant that the Scottish negotiators inserted a precondition into the treaty, and that precondition was that for all time coming, the people of Scotland would remain sovereign and also would retain the right to salvo, in other words, the right to remove their own monarch, their own government, or to sue their government if it created legislation which was harmful to individuals or organisations. Now, this is unique in the world, but until very recently, most people in Scotland were completely unaware of this. But this week has seen the publication of 3 separate articles by, I would say, well-known pro-independence political writers who are knowledgeable and learned, and one of which is Elliot Bulmer. Now, Elliot Bulmer is, I would classify Elliot as probably more of a moderate independence campaigner. He very famously wrote a constitution for Scotland, and I have to be honest here and say I haven't read Elliot Bulmer's constitution, but what I do know about him, and this is only literally from hearsay, so I'm sure other people will correct me, is that Elliot's view is very much more, as I say, moderate about independence. And I believe, although I'm sure somebody may correct me here, that Elliot Bulmer is not against keeping the monarchy either. So he was an unusual candidate to produce an article in which he mentioned the word colony or colonisation. Now, this, as I say, has been a taboo for many years. Scots have been deterred from actually even mentioning the word colony, that Scotland might be a colony of the British state. But the facts speak for themselves. For 300 years, and remember, before the Treaty of Union, there were constant wars, England constantly invading Scotland and trying to take it over. And those wars lasted for over a century. And eventually, after the Treaty of Union, there were still tens of thousands of English soldiers in over 45 different garrisons and castles all across Scotland, and this was in place for many, many years. The Black Watch, incidentally, famous regiment in Scotland, the Black Watch, was established by England in order to seek out and eliminate anybody in the Highlands who had any inkling of being involved in any movement at all to end the Union or to resist the Union or any connection with the Jacobite cause. So Scotland was militarily occupied at the beginning of its pathway, if you like, into the Union. It was ruthlessly colonised. It was ruthlessly rid of all of the occupants of the Highlands. They literally cleared the Highlands, not just of trees, but of people. Anyone from Highland communities, Highland clans, was basically uprooted, evicted, and sent to British slave colonies, or basically just put on ships elsewhere. The country was subject to ethnic cleansing, effectively. And thereafter, over the next 2 centuries, many people from England decided to move to Scotland. Now, Nobody is claiming for a moment that this was a deliberate act where the British state decided it was going to move a whole bunch of English people to Scotland to try to anglicise it. But it did happen over many centuries, and it happened because Scotland was an attractive place to live, and it still is a very attractive place to live for people moving from England. But having done this, we've effectively ended up with a mixture of people in Scotland, and we regard everyone who comes here as a Scot, no matter where they originated. So there is a mix. I think that's fair to say. But what would be taboo would be to say that there was a colonisation by population. That happened, but not as a deliberate act of the Union. It happened over centuries. Now, the problem with all of this is, of course, that to regard Scotland as a colony, we have to look at what the definition of a colony is. And a colony, essentially, is where the resources of the place which has been taken over, shall we say, by a larger entity, all of those resources are removed by that larger nation, if you want to call it the mother nation, if you like. And they're removed at no cost, basically. They're just taken away and sold, and for the benefit of the mother country. And then such things as utilities like gas and oil and power and other things as well, which are only from Scotland, are sold back to the colony at a far higher price. So basically, a colony is a country which is exploited by another and which never sees any benefit from that exploitation. And I think Scotland falls very neatly into the classification of an exploitation colony. It just happens to be attached to the colonising country by a land border. And unlike Britain's other colonies, and if I remember Alex Salmon's speech correctly, over 63 other nations have become independent of the British colonial state since World War II, all except the Celtic nations of Scotland, Wales, and what's left of part of Ireland, which is still colonised by the British state, because that is very much a colony, and that was very deliberately done in Northern Ireland by the British state. And they used lowland poor Scots to do this and to turn people against each other on the basis of religion, and it's an old part of the British playbook. However, here in Scotland, nobody was supposed to talk about colonisation, far less liberation. In the past, the word liberation has been used to describe, for example, the situation in Palestine, where for many years there was an organisation called the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organisation, set up by a man called Yasser Arafat, who I believe is now dead. And he set up basically the PLO. The PLO was, I suppose you would call it, a paramilitary organisation, what we would now call a terrorist organisation in British parlance, to liberate Palestine from occupation by Israel. Now, we know all of the history of Israel and Palestine, and we're seeing that playing out on our television screens at the moment. As I mentioned before, the creation of Israel was actually done by the United Kingdom many years ago in 1913 with the Balfour what was it called? The Balfour Agreement. And the Balfour Agreement arranged for there to be a state for the formerly stateless Jews from across Europe, who eventually, as we know, during World War II, were ruthlessly exterminated by the Nazis, who attempted a full genocide of the Jews. So them having a state was certainly something which needed to be done. However, the British basically decided they were going to kick the Palestinians out of where they were living in Palestine and basically allow the Jews to settle in this area. And this is what started the entire thing off. Now, we can all, I think, have some sympathy for Jews, because they have been probably the most persecuted and abused people of all time, virtually. The Palestinians are now sharing that fate with the Jewish people, and unfortunately the two now are at each other's throats because of what Hamas has done. recently in Israel. However, here in Scotland, thankfully, we do not have that situation, but we are nevertheless a colony of the United Kingdom, and we need to decolonise. Because if the UK is not going to allow a political solution to happen, and we could call this a two-state solution, because it would be Scotland and England just separating themselves from one another again, Scotland taking back all of its powers and having a new relationship with its next door neighbour, would be a two-state solution. So there are some similarities here, although there's no actual fighting going on. But we couldn't in the past say the word liberation, and yet now it is used every day. And so there is now an organisation called Liberation Scotland, which is a free organisation. Anyone can join it. For people who support the idea that Scotland should end its treaty with Union, unilaterally end it. In other words, say, that's it, we've had enough. It needs to be done democratically, of course. There needs to be a vote upon it, and that can't happen as long as England is in control, as long as our own politicians have basically been colonised by England, because that is what's happened. England now controls not the people of Scotland, but it controls the political parties of Scotland. It keeps them in check. It controls the political apparatus of Scotland, that's its parliament, and to a large extent it now controls its councils and local authorities as well, by giving itself the right to make direct payments without any devolved administration involvement at all. And it's also given itself new powers to interfere in the, I would say, the economic health of Scotland in a way which is completely unfair, because let's say Scotland has legislation which creates a better atmosphere for business, perhaps lower taxation, perhaps improves connectivity, provides help for businesses in Scotland. Unless the same help is provided by England, they will use their new Internal Market Act to prevent the Scottish Government from legislating in that way, so that Scotland is just as bad as England. And because of all of these things, there is no way that we can decolonise by asking permission. And because all of the levers of power are in the hands of the English state, they even, incidentally, are trying to control our laws as well, to a large extent. They're trying to control our legal system. And in fact, if I remember correctly, the Supreme Court of Scotland, which is the Court of Sessions in our House, is technically, according to the Treaty of Union, subject to English parliamentary scrutiny and perhaps even interference at some level. There's some dispute over how much power they have over this. But the point I'm trying to make here is that all the important levers of power which Scotland should have in its parliament are being controlled from elsewhere. And the people who are put in these organisations, such as, for example, the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, Scottish National Parks, Scotland's, Scotland's tourism industry. To a very large extent, there's a great deal of foreign interference, and there's a lot of colonisation, not just of people, but colonisation of the mind, where the people who work in these industries believe that these industries, these organisations, these non-governmental quangos, if you want to call them that, these organisations which carry out the work on behalf, supposedly, of the Scottish Government, are actually mostly under the control of the UK. And because of all of these things, the only way we can escape from this is to actually unilaterally declare that we are going to have a referendum ourselves. And as I mentioned the other day, this is how it's normally done. Now, in other news, it came to light yesterday, and I saw this, and I thought, well, here we go again. Nicola Sturgeon has passed her driving test. Well, I'm a driving instructor. Thousands of people pass their driving tests all of the time, every day. It's not really newsworthy. A former First Minister passes a driving test at 53, first time, which is a great achievement, incidentally. Is it really news, though? I mean, Nicola Sturgeon is regarded now as a has-been, someone who was extremely famous, well-respected, extremely successful in what she did, admired across the world, and is now in the sidelines. She has been shunted up a sideline and is just sitting there leading a normal everyday life, which I'm sure she is grateful to finally be able to do. But is it really news? Would you really think that, you know, somebody passing the driving test is front page news in Scotland? To me, it smacks of parochialism and infantilism. The British state media is now saying, look how far your First Minister has fallen. She's now back to normal level with everybody else and is having to sit her driving test. And it's almost as if they're mocking her in publishing this. I wouldn't, as First Minister, I would not have published that post in that way. It's nice that she's passed, but honestly, I think it's just making her more of a target and a distraction. Anyway, I digress. On to Sir Keir Starmer. It has come to light that Mr. Starmer, far from being enthusiastic about winning votes in Scotland and looking after the interests of the people of Scotland, is actually planning to build 7 new nuclear power stations here in Scotland. 7 of them. Why not in England, I have to say? Well, I think the answer to that is because the voters that he's really interested in are the Tory voters of the south, the NIMBYs, the not in my backyards. We don't want nuclear power stations near us, but we want to have them. But Sir Keir Starmer is quite happy to put all of those in Scotland in the same way that they did with Dounreay, which was a highly experimental and potentially dangerous nuclear reactor in the north of Scotland, and it was put there to be as far away from London as possible, so if anything went wrong, it was only the jocks which would be irradiated. And here we've got Sir Keir Starmer doing precisely the same thing all over again, after this article which I mentioned yesterday, which said that England was now looking forward to utilising Scotland's tidal resources to solve its energy problems in the future. And now here's Keir Starmer coming along and saying, we don't need to really worry about tidal energy. We're just going to build 7 nuclear power stations in Scotland, and the poor old jocks will just have to put up with it. He does not care, and he's not the slightest bit interested in what we want or need. In fact, he's quite happy to dump all of that toxic waste here. And by the way, don't get the idea that it's that we're not ever going to have things like private nuclear waste dumps in Scotland. That could very well happen in the future. All kinds of laws will be changed by the United Kingdom to make it possible to dump more toxins in Scotland than ever before. They will change the laws to allow themselves to do this, and Keir Starmer is already saying that's exactly what he's going to do. So let's not be fooled into thinking that Labour has the answer and that it's better than the SNP and it's going to make your life better. It's not. It's going to make Scotland an awful lot worse. And building unnecessary nuclear power stations in Scotland when we have an abundance of natural energy already flowing out of the place is plainly ridiculous. So I think we are looking down the barrels here of a general election next year, which is going to be largely irrelevant to us. We will try and win as many pro-independence MP seats as we possibly can, and if we get majority and Hamza Yusuf is as good as his word, he will demand negotiations with England. England will say no. He will then demand a Section 30 order. England will say no, and then we don't know what happens after that. And it's this bit about what happens after that that we really need to sort out. And the action has to be simply this. In the event that we win a majority of seats, as promised, and we demand those negotiations, or that Section 30 order if we don't get the negotiations, and they say no, there needs to be a second phase. And that second phase has to be saying, right, we've tried everything else, you're not prepared to play ball, so we're going to take it over your heads. We're going to hold a referendum by ourselves. We're going to do that by reconstituting our own Scottish Parliament outside of the building you call Holyrood and out with its constraints. And we're going to bring all of our elected officials together to do that. And we'll hold a referendum and challenge you to stop it. And in the meantime, we'll be sending our own representatives to all the international courts and other bodies of a similar nature, like the Council of Europe, the EU, the International Court of Rights, the European Court of Human Rights, etc., etc. because there isn't anything else we can do. And unless we take this action, then nothing will change. And we will remain a colony, we'll keep being plundered, and we'll be polluted by nuclear waste, because that's what Keir Starmer says he wants to do. So no matter who ends up winning in London, whether it's Labour or the Tory party, nothing is going to change. If the SNP wins a majority of seats at Westminster next year, nothing will change. They'll still say no to negotiations. They'll still say no to a Section 30 order. Somebody said in a post today, which I read, would it be possible for the Tories, just out of pure spite, to grant Scotland a Section 30 order at the last minute, just before the general election, to thwart Labour in some way, to distract from the Labour vote in Scotland and cause them to lose votes? I don't think so, but you know, anything can happen. We've been so far, ever since Brexit, we have been down a rabbit hole, and I don't honestly think that anything is impossible. You never know. However, I don't hold out a great deal of hope. But since we're a colony, and since we have a liberation organisation now, and since Salvo exists and is planning to take our case to international courts for decolonisation, then that might be the only way we get out of this. Because if the SNP doesn't grow a backbone and hold a referendum in spite of the United Kingdom, which incidentally is what it said it would do, then nothing is going to change. In the meantime, keep the faith. Remember that it's the people here who are sovereign. You are sovereign. You are the ones who have the power over your government and the English government and the monarch. You can decide to depose them any time you like under your own constitution, guaranteed in the Treaty of Union. So keep thinking about this, and remember that it's not the politicians who have the power in Scotland. They are controlled by Westminster. They're limited by Westminster. They have to work under Westminster conditions. They cannot create independence by themselves. It comes from us, and only we can make it happen. If the SNP fails next year to do it, then it'll be down to us. I'll see you soon. Bye for now.